it's almost as if you could finish the curriculum then, right? uh, we were very, very fortunate to have Jorge, who was just a Stanford undergrad, and he's was a sophomore then, right? He just graduated, and he's actually starting something called Reap Mexico now, and is very interested in doing some of the very similar things in Mexico. So what did we just escape? Yeah. That sort of takes it sort of tries to set the stage for what development is about. Obviously, there's nothing about the process in there, but I know that talking to Jorge, what he was struck at, he spent days and days and weeks in these different venues, and the idea though was that people, no matter if they're poor, in transition, or they become rich, they sort of are people, right? And they sort of are interested in the same things, and that they really do want to find a meaningful life, secure life, and something that I know my kids would never say, that they want their parents to have a very nice, wonderful life. Man, there is culture in here too, right? that we never get there. The reason why we work in two communities are poor, rural, and migrant communities. They're actually exactly the same people. Okay, and what we get into a little bit in the curriculum here is if I was showing that if I was showing it to some students, I might, because you don't get enough of a glimpse here. Let's turn around. I take a lot of Stanford groups, and I take a lot of student groups out to the rural areas and sort of do teaching, out there. Before I go, what I'll do is I'll take my wallet out and I say, bribery will get you everywhere. I say, anybody who finds a young man between the ages of 20 and 40, this 100 yen, $15, 100 yen bill is yours. And of course, the rest of the 2 weeks we're out in the rural areas, they're looking as hard as they can for young males between the ages of 20 and 40. There are none. What's happening, what you saw, where you saw old men, old women, some moms stay behind with their children, and then all the men are gone to the cities. So the peasant workers basically are the fathers who have gone into the cities and are working there. Sometimes if their mother and father are very healthy, they'll leave their kid there and they'll bring their wife with them, and just mother and father will work in the city, and grandma will raise the kids back in the villages. If there's nobody there, then they'll often bring the whole family with them. And the schools they were actually attending were migrant schools. And so the peasant workers and basically you saw the older generation in the village and the younger generation in the cities working. They're included in the migration. First of all, there's very little intercity migration by urbanites. There are some by college graduates, very highly educated. There is some, but by far and away, most people live where they were born. But that wouldn't be the migration that we're talking about. Though it's an important part, having a national labor market for professionals, but that's not part of the story here. This is really about migration from rural to urban. Other questions? Other comments? Other comments? We should listen to. Okay, now let's get into this, and then we've actually got some time when we're going to try to engage you with some questions. Okay, so poverty. Poverty in the world. So the way the whole book is set up is every section, so the poverty section, first of all, talks about poverty in general, and then we talk about poverty in China. And one thing that we're trying to do is point out that, basically China is like the rest of the world. It's following this development path, right? And its poverty is like poverty. The other thing we're trying to do is we will stop inside these and try to make parallels to the U.S. and try to make parallels maybe to Mexico and elsewhere that may be more sort of closer to home to some of the kids in the classes. So how do you define poverty? These are just some facts, right? Poverty line required just enough food and supplies to survive, living on $1.25 a day. There's 1.4 billion people who live on that. 20% of all humans are still very poor. Yeah, just the facts, right? And then what we try to do is go in there and say, well, what do you get for $1.25 a day? There's a super paper called Living at $1.25 a Day. It's written by a couple MIT colleagues of mine, and they basically spend the whole paper sort of spinning out what it's like to try to survive on that. And of course, those are the people we saw in the first part of the movie, right? First part of the film. What don't you get for $1.25 a day, right? So just the bare necessities, barely enough to eat, barely enough to wear, barely enough to live in, a roof over your house. And of course, it's not everything we take for granted there. I like it this time. I know when I teach this in my class at Stanford, it's right back to what the question the gentleman just asked back there is, what about poverty in the U.S.? How is it the same, similar, and different? The poverty in the U.S., right, is West Oakland, right? Hunters Point, East Palo Alto, right? It's urban poverty, and it's the poverty we see, around us. And so in this way, it's very, very different. Almost all poverty in China is rural poverty. And almost all poverty in poor countries in Asia, where they've distributed land, is in other countries like Latin America and Africa, we're starting to get enormous urban poverty that coexists with rural poverty. So it's a very different one. Plus, in the book, we talk a lot about absolute poverty versus relative poverty. In the United States, you can't live on $1.25 a day. You would die, right? Because prices are so high and there's no access. A homeless probably lives on $4 a day, and of course they're very, very, very poor. But we call it relative poverty. And sort of we help deal with this and really try to get the discussion going a little about the differences that happen there. But no matter where you're at, whether it's urban poverty in the U.S. or rural poverty in China or elsewhere in the world, there's three real strong correlates of poverty. What are connected with that? One is people have very low health and education. Oftentimes, our homeless have lots and lots of health problems. Health problems cause their homelessness, or homelessness led to their health problems. Education is a lot behind it. Another is very, very poor quality of land. That's why I think Jorge just, he went to a lot of different areas. We went to the Southwest, where it's actually very, very poor too, but it's sort of lush and green. People don't have any land, and the land doesn't hold water. It's sort of a limestone soil that's very low productive, and the people from Southwest China are just as poor as Northwest China, but you really get the sense that you don't want to live in those villages and try to farm. So they have very poor quality land, unsuitable for agriculture, and there's a lack of markets and services. You are out in the middle of nowhere, right? It begs the question, how did they ever get there in the first place, right? But we don't really sort of deal with that here. But there's a lot of history behind that. So the other thing we talk about is poverty and vulnerability, and you don't quite see it in the video, but we talk about a lot here about what does it mean to be vulnerable. that were affected by risk, that you get sick and you can't cure, you don't have enough money to go treat yourself. You are hungry and your crops fail, right? And that you don't have insurance for this, and that you have natural disasters and you just can't go and get a check from the insurance company. So we talk a little about the vulnerability that people have and how that drives their behavior. And this is in general as well as in China. So, and then we really start to talk about, okay, so let's now, we don't want people living at these levels of poverty. Development is about getting people above that poverty line. What do they do? And there's two things. One is you give them income earning abilities, and two, you give them the ability to insure themselves against the vulnerabilities, against the risks, and jobs are stable, income, schools, health infrastructure, market opportunities, and credit. These are the things that we all take for granted, but that are putting those institutions into place are what helps you both raise incomes and then reduce the risks. And so economic development provides these things in order to boost income, productivity, security, and comfort, right? And so it's really trying to paint this very simple, purposely simple picture of poverty, not to get bogged down. But then once we've done that, so let's go look at China, right? And let's go look at poverty in China. They've seen this, and always start with a few facts. Economists always have to start with those few facts, so get ourselves going. How many people live in China at $1.25 per day? And the answer is 200 million, right? It's almost 2/3 of the population of the whole U.S. That's how many people are living at that very, very low level. So, this is the country that we're told is going to bury us in the next 10 years or 20 years, if you believe the New York Times. There's still 200 million people that can't buy two pairs of shoes, right? And so it's that development process sort of right out in front of us. Oops, there we go. So where do they live? Just do a little bit of geography. If you take China and you just divide the map of China up like this is one of my favorite maps in China. That second line to the left actually divides the landmass exactly into half. Okay, so half of China's land is to the left of that, to the west of that, half is to the east. 95% or 90% of the population lives to the right or to the east of the second line. Only 5 to 10% live out there in number 3, which is basically desert. But most of the poor people live in that sort of central mountainous area. And the New York Times and Bloomberg have all of their outlets in the East Coast. And so that's why we see the big stories of urbanization come out of there. So China's the geography is super important to all this. So the barriers to overcome poverty. So we talked about what poverty was all about, right? The correlates, and then we try to build on those correlates and say, okay, so how do we overcome them, right? You don't have any land, right? You don't have any assets. And in the book we talk about, well, what do you do with people who have, well, what do they have? The thing that poor people have, and it's one asset that all poor people have, is labor, right? And it's their own physical strength and their own mental ability. And we do a lot of that, and that's starting to tie and going to build the resonance into why migration is important, right? And then why the way out of poverty is going to be education, nutrition, and health. Because you want to build up the only asset that they have, so then they can go tie in to the rest of the economy. It's these people living, I hope everybody can see, is it might be nice to go on a vacation to Ningxia the place where we saw the first one because it's so interesting. Maybe on a big air-conditioned tour bus, but you don't want to live there for the rest of your life, right? And that's so. Number one, you have to get out of there. In a country like China, the only way to get out of poverty is to leave. And working age people, nongmingong, right? The peasant migrants are have left, but it's still there's still 200 million people that are living back in these areas, and because leaving takes time, right? So poverty remains, though it's very much down. One thing we talk about in here, we have a little box. I think it made it into the volume where we say there's still 200 million people that are poor in China, but you have to understand is that 30 years ago there was 500 million people in poverty. And so that the World Millennium Development Goal is to reduce the amount of people living under $1.25 a day by 2015. The world's almost going to make it, the Millennium Development Goal. Two-thirds or 75% of the reduction in poverty has come in one country, and that's China. So it's still poor. There's still a lot of people there, but they've made a lot of progress in getting people out of poverty. And so ultimately, all will leave the countryside. How do you escape poverty for good? Increasement of health. We talked about this. Education. Now, in all of these, this is just sort of a. This is just, if you've looked through it, you know, in every single one of these, there's, and believe me, this is SPICE working. This isn't an economist at Stanford. They've put the curriculum together so every one of these different sections, poverty, migration, urbanization, and development, has handouts, sort of daily handouts, daily or one or two PowerPoints. There's one or two PowerPoints that have already been developed for you. They're more developed than what I showed you here. They go a little slower through the material. And they're on the second DVD. The first DVD has these little videos on it. There's village case studies that are in there that are looking at people. So if you look at pages 74 to 78, you can just see sort of poverty through the eyes of these different, of Xiaoqiang, of two parents talking about their kids, Mr. Tian, who's a teacher, the principal of a teacher, a principal of a school, and then this is a high school dropout who then he talks about how I'm so sad I dropped out. It wasn't worth it, and he talks about how he was attracted by the lights of the school and he's going to pay for it later. So there's these little case studies that try to show poverty from different angles. And then there's a video. If I'm not going to show it to you, Control H, but you can see if you hit this here. There's a 5-minute video on poverty, okay? And this will be, so we did a lot of pre-testing sort of and trial of this. People really liked the first video. I think everybody really liked it. Jorge did a fantastic job. These next three are like 5-minute little videos. And some said that they were, a little bit repetitive of the material in the book, and others said it was too prescriptive, right? It's like 5 minutes you try to tell. You can decide if you want to use them or not. But that's just another resource, that's there. And then the last thing on the DVD is there's slideshows or just lots of photos and lots of materials. So when the students went out to the field, they took thousands of photos, and then we distilled them down. What are there, 20 or 30? Yeah, 20 or 30 photos in there that if people want to use them for their own PowerPoint slideshows or just to get a little broader view of what's going on. So basically that's repeated, not only poverty but migration and the other ones. Okay. My feeling is if you get done with this part of the if you get done with this part of the uh, curriculum, you really want your students to be able to talk about, what are the dimensions of impacts and causes of poverty in China in general, in the U.S., really trying to always deal with the dynamic of there, and then what are some of the solutions. And, even after what were there, 7 minutes on poverty in the video, and I gave you 15 PowerPoint slides, are you to the point where you can start making statements about this? And I think that there's a little more about poverty in general, more facts in here, but I think that I'm thinking most of our high school students are at least exposed to think about poverty. They've seen homeless. They've seen, they've driven on the freeways through West Oakland, and think about that. Some of them may indeed be in school in these areas, but the discussion questions that I would have would be sitting here. Sort of, what are the dimensions, the impact of poverty in the U.S., in China? What are some of the solutions? And then really trying to categorize them into different subsections of solutions. Do we want to? Yeah, because I think what happens is once we get to through the migration section, we're going to break into some groups and have a little more time to deal with it. So the one solution to poverty, or more specifically, the part of the process of development that solves poverty, brings us to this next section of the curriculum, and that's called Migrating Out of Poverty. Now, I was invited once up to Sacramento State, and in Sac State, they were having a symposia on sweatshops, and they saw some work I did on migrant workers, and it sort of was a very positive story about all these work, that China already had this was in 1999, 2000, something like that. China already had 180 million people in the migrant labor force, and more were due to come out, and their incomes had gone up, and da-da-da-da-da, okay? So, and they saw this online, and so they invited me to speak at this symposium on sweatshops. And so I said, I'd be happy to go and talk a little about it. And I didn't know even else was in the program. So I pull in, and there's this gymnasium in Sac State, and there's this big banner called, Workshop on Sweatshops in China. And it has against sweatshops, and it's like the Coalition for Anti-Sweatshop Behavior, the International Labor Organization, pro sweatshops, Professor Rozelle from Stanford University. It's like, oops. and of course, I didn't get much in the way of talking that night, I don't think I won the debate with that particular group. But the fact is what we try to do in this section is really talk about migration in general, and how it is an escape from poverty on the one hand, on the other hand, that it's a really hard thing. What we don't deal with in here that we really struggle with is there's also a whole social into it, in that in China today, migration has led to huge family breakups, and has led to problems of injured family members, and then just left behind kids, and the mental pressures that go on all this. And we touch on it a little bit, but we really are looking at hard work, living away from home in the environment of discrimination, leaving behind these terrible, remote, hard-living rural areas. And what are you going to choose? It's like choose your poison. Okay, and so what we do in this section is really look at the economics of migration and urbanization and the cost and benefits. So, it's like, and I think that throughout this, as students start to work on this, you get them to start writing down the cost and the benefits of why you would ever do this, right, of migration. And then, of course, since they're all migrating, it must be that benefits are greater than the cost. But that doesn't mean those costs aren't very seriously. The push and the pull factors, what are causing the costs and the benefits, and then life as a migrant. These are the themes that we try to get out of there. So one of the most, I think I've had students tell me that if they say the one graph that they learn the most about in all the classes that I teach is this one right here, and it's called the iron law of development. And that's this actually was done by Simon Kuznets, who was a Chicago professor. He won the first Nobel Prize for economics for doing this empirical work. The second one was Kenneth Arrow, who was a Stanford professor, is 92 years old, still on the staff, is my colleague there. But the first one was Simon Kuznets, and he basically graphed out this empirical regularity of income per capita and percentage of population in agriculture, or percentage of population living in rural areas. And that you see that there's no country that is high income where more than 10% of the population live in the agriculture sector, right? Zero, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And so as a nation grows and modernizes, people move from farms to countryside if they want to become an industrialized, urbanized, rich, developed country, right? And all developed countries have gone through the eras of migration, right? I think that from the Europeans, coming over to the U.S. to the rural and urban migration that is certainly part of California's history, and the same economics are driving this, that are driving Chinese rural peasants to move to the city and become peasant workers, right? And so then we start helping students make this sort of checklist. So where to look for the benefits of migration, right? More opportunities for work, higher wages, better services, right? You might want to have your kids get educated, have better health care, just a better quality of life, more opportunities for your children. Over and over and over again, when we sat down with women who had brought their kids to the city, and they lived in a great big house in a very peaceful village and had a farm. They had to work hard there. And then they were shoved into this little one-room, 10-foot by 10-foot little hovel with a bed that 3 people slept in, and they had to cook over a kerosene stove, wash dishes outside. You say, why are you even doing this? It's for my children. My kids are going to be better off by being here in the city, right? And so you have this whole checklist of the benefit side, but there's challenges or costs, right? There's the breakup of families. You have to leave home, sweet home, right? It's difficult to find good housing. It's sometimes difficult to find good work. Certainly in China, it's not hard to find work today, but in many developing countries, it is hard to find work. May face discrimination. Conditions in migrant communities can be, in some dimensions, as poor or worse than in the rural areas. So why migrate, right? The benefits outweigh the costs, right? And that's kind of how we deal with it there. And so, what role does migration play in development, right? In China, that in the early 1980s, 0. In the past 30 years, 200 million migrants have moved to the city. So before I go any further, we're going to watch this video, and then I really want to, Matt's going to organize a little activity for us here, and we're going to break into, I think, 8 tables, and we're going to assign everybody to this group 1A, 1B, group 2A, 2B, and we're going to try to think about migration sort of not in the context of China yet. We're going to deal with that down here, but other migrations. And so after watching the China video, to try to start thinking about, why anybody from Mexico today, comes to the U.S. Why people in the late 20th century left Lithuania, Ireland, Italy, and came to the U.S. Why do Chinese today come to the U.S.? Right? This isn't the railroad building Chinese, right? These are the graduate students that come over. Or I know Palo Alto, where I live, the housing prices are soaring through the roof because the Chinese are coming over and investing $500,000 minimum, but you got to pay $2.5 million to buy a house in Palo Alto, to buy a house so they can send their kid to school here. Why are people doing that and migrating now? And how about, oops, I made a mistake here. This should be U.S. to Mexico. Sorry about that. Why doesn't it happen? Or so the idea is to really look at, to do the cost benefits calculations for this and talk about these questions. So, but let's listen to the video and then we'll
With explosive growth over the past 3 decades, China's economy is rapidly urbanizing, industrializing, and modernizing. Migration has played a key role in this growth and transformation. Since the 1970s, over 200 million people have left their rural farms and migrated to cities where they take jobs in factories and the service sector. The scale of China's continued migration is unprecedented in human history. Why are all these people moving to cities? Staying in the village or moving to a city has costs and benefits. People living in poor, rural areas often have limited means to improve their livelihood. In contrast, life in cities offers the promise of more varied job options and higher income. With higher wages, migrant workers can send money to family members in the countryside. Migrants often view the booming city as a new window to a brighter future. That is the push factor that sends millions of rural residents out of the villages to the cities. Even though the benefits of migration tend to outweigh the costs of leaving home, very often the life of a migrant is a constant struggle. Where do migrants end up? Although opportunities are more available than where they came from, there is little romance in the life of most migrants. Migrants often live in migrant communities, loosely knit neighborhoods full of simple dwellings and shops on the outskirts of cities. Here, buildings are old, falling apart, and sometimes half demolished. Streets and sidewalks are cracked and littered with trash or simply made of dirt. Families of 3, 4, or more might live in a cramped, one-room family space. Sleeping, cooking, eating, and storage frequently occurs within an area of only a few square meters. Migrant factory workers also live in crowded, dingy dormitories on construction sites or factory grounds. Because most migrants are uneducated, they usually can only find work in the unskilled labor market. Their jobs are likely to be strenuous, dangerous, or tedious. Migrants can face harassment and discrimination in the workplace and rarely enjoy the same legal protections that are available to urban residents. Migrants also frequently face discrimination from local urbanites in their day-to-day lives. As increasing numbers of rural Chinese decide to migrate to cities, more children are making the move with their parents. Migrant children face many obstacles entering urban public schools. For this reason, for-profit schools crop up in abandoned buildings, unused factory floors, or other derelict spaces. Today, these migrant schools remain notorious for bare-bones facilities, fragmented curricula, high student turnover, and incompetent teachers. Educational outcomes among migrant children tend to be very low at these schools. Not all children make the move with their parents. An estimated 20 million children are living with grandparents or other relatives as their parents move away to find work. China is not the only country to undergo large-scale migration. Every developed country has had a migratory generation that must make huge sacrifices. Migrant life is difficult in many respects, but it offers the promise of opportunity that simply does not exist in the countryside. In the next 20 years, hundreds of millions more migrants will enter China's cities in search of this promise. Properly incorporating these individuals into the economy and fabric of society and allowing them to improve their standard of living are core challenges for China's continued development.